There's a moment, almost imperceptible, when everything begins to give way. Nothing moves on the outside, and yet the field shifts. It's when attention, once focused on what is seen, gently turns toward the one who is seeing, as if the mirror stopped reflecting the world and began to reflect the gaze itself. In that moment, silent and sacred, the observer recognizes themselves as part of what they see, and what once felt solid, inevitable, immutable, begins to vibrate differently. It's hard to notice this moment. It has no shape, no warning. It reveals itself in the exhaustion of trying to control what always slips away, in the fatigue of repeating cycles that defy logic, in the silence between one thought and another, where something inside whispers, maybe what keeps everything the same is the way you're seeing it. Many spend entire decades trying to change reality through effort, repetition, faith, but they keep observing with the eyes of pain, of defense, of memory, and so reality, like a hypnotic mirror, merely confirms the vibration that hasn't yet shifted. This is the point where something needs to break, not outside, inside. And what if, instead of fighting what appears, you simply turn toward the one who observes? What if the prison isn't in the circumstances, but in the identity of the one perceiving them? Because when the observer becomes the observed, the inner script begins to dissolve, and what was once lived on autopilot begins to be touched by presence. This video is an invitation to that moment, a subtle dive between the gaze and what is seen, where reality is no longer something to be conquered, but a field to be understood. Everything begins to change, not because something external has transformed, but because the lens has finally been touched by awareness. Have you noticed how most reactions come before awareness? As if something inside you responds even before the moment is truly felt. A sideways glance, a sharp word, an absence that touches an old wound, and suddenly you're already there, feeling rejected, small, frustrated, as if the pain were always lurking, waiting for a chance to dress the present in the clothes of the past. That's where the subtle trick of repetition lies. It's not life that insists. It's the observer still looking with old eyes. And while the gaze carries the marks of what once hurt, everything around tends to reorganize to validate that vibration. This is not punishment. It's reflection. Reality knows how to do only one thing: reflect. And the reflection always follows the observer's vibration. The mind wants to solve everything with logic, but the field doesn't respond to reasoning. It responds to frequency. That's why so many people claim to be awake, conscious, spiritually engaged, and still feel stuck, confused, disconnected, because they're trying to change the outer world with new ideas, but with the same old observer. An observer who still feels needy, guilty, inadequate. An observer who seeks evolution, but carries fear of change. As long as you observe through defense, the world seems to attack. As long as you observe through urgency, reality seems delayed. As long as you observe through doubt, the signs become confusing. It's like trying to see with fogged-up eyes and blaming the landscape for looking blurry. What you see is not what is. It's what you're being while seeing. There comes a point when this becomes unbearable. Not because it's bad, but because the soul begins to scream in silence. It feels that something is wrong, that living this way no longer fits, that the exhaustion isn't physical, it's spiritual, and that there's no use running, changing places, relationships, purposes, if the observer remains unchanged. That point is not the end, it's the turning. The space where time seems suspended, and you begin to ask, who is living this life? Who is behind the thoughts that keep repeating? Who observes fear arise even before anything real happens? Who feels the heart race when no one has threatened them? The true observer does not judge. It simply sees. It does not react. It welcomes. It doesn't try to control what appears. It sustains presence. And in this simple shift, something changes everything. Because when presence is established, frequency adjusts. And when frequency changes, the reflection obeys. It's not magic. It's vibrational coherence. It's like tuning into a radio station. The content you receive depends on the frequency you emit. No matter how much you want to hear something new, if you keep turning the dial to the same bands, you'll keep hearing the same songs. The world is not deaf to your request, but it can only respond to your vibration. Then a choice arises, not forced, not rational but felt. The choice to to silence the internal noise trying to explain everything, to break from automatic reaction, to resist the impulse that the mind offers as absolute truth, to breathe before repeating, to observe before defending, to watch yourself before acting. In that space, the past loses power, because it is no longer in control. The memory still exists, but it doesn't steer. Pain may still visit, but it doesn't build the house. And reality, once projected by trauma, begins to respond to presence. It is in this field that the observer dissolves as identity and becomes pure awareness. No longer someone trying to change the world, but the world itself being seen from a different place, a place where struggle ceases, where effort becomes observation, where wanting is replaced by resonance, where doing is guided by vibration, not by lack. You don't need to understand everything right now, nor feel total peace in this instant. But maybe just for today, you can stop trying to control what arises and simply witness without rush, without escape, just with honesty. Because it's in the honesty of your gaze that reality begins to reorganize. There's a scene that repeats in many people's memory, the body present but the soul absent. A conversation taking place, but your mind is already far away, chewing over something that was said days ago, or fearing something that hasn't even happened yet. And when you realize it, you've already reacted, already said what you didn't mean to, already shut down as if it were inevitable. But the present moment, that was lost. This disconnection doesn't happen by conscious choice. It's the result of a deep programming that teaches anticipate, defend yourself, survive, and the observer, instead of being anchored in the now, starts operating from a place of constant vigilance, as if the world were always a hidden threat. And all perception begins to be distorted by that filter. You no longer see the other person. You see the memories they trigger. You no longer feel the now. You feel the automatic reaction to what they seem to represent. And thus, reality becomes a field of projections, where you don't live what is, but relive what was. Observation, in that state, is contaminated by the past. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." What we often call destiny is merely an unrecognized observer, repeating unseen patterns, sustaining vibrations that no longer make sense, but continue operating because they were never illuminated. And here is where something profound needs to be understood. It's not enough to want to change reality. You must recognize who is observing that reality, because the observer's vibration is the code life reads before manifesting. When you observe with fear, even opportunities seem like risks. When you observe with guilt, even love feels like a threat. When you observe with haste, time stretches into resistance. But when you observe with presence, something rare happens. The world slows down. The other ceases to be an enemy. Pain ceases to be a sentence. And the moment begins to feel enough. The question is how to return to that inner place where presence becomes the center. It's not about effort. It's not about technique. It's about emptying. A kind of surrender that only happens when you are deeply tired of trying to solve everything with your mind. There's a point when control gives way, not out of defeat, but out of clarity, because you begin to realize that mental effort, emotional self-defense, excessive thinking aren't saving you, they're distancing you from life, from yourself, from the moment. And when this collapse of control happens, a new inner window opens. It doesn't bring immediate answers, but it brings a different quality of perception. You start to feel what you're feeling. It seems obvious, but it's not. For years, you've been feeling sensations without observing them. You've been reacting before even allowing the emotion to speak. And in this new space where feeling is permitted, a silence arises. And in that silence, the observer begins to be revealed. Not the wounded observer who reacts, but the one who witnesses. The one who silently has always been there, observing everything, even the versions you believed yourself to be. This observer doesn't need to defend itself. It doesn't need to prove anything. It doesn't want to be anything. It simply is. And from that place, the quantum field responds, because the field responds to the vibration of consciousness, not the ego's narrative. What you feel, in essence, is what collapses into reality. The field doesn't understand arguments. It understands resonance. And as long as you continue observing with the eyes of fear, of lack, of judgment, The world will keep reflecting the same storyline. But with the slightest gesture of presence, everything shifts. Not through magic, but through frequency. That's the true turning point. The moment you stop trying to change the world and start observing differently. It's not passivity, it's alchemy. Because true transmutation doesn't happen through effort, but through clarity. And clarity is born from observation without judgment. When the observer becomes self-aware, it no longer needs to manipulate what it sees. It understands. And in understanding, it dissolves. Pain no longer needs to scream. The body no longer needs to tense. The mind begins to rest. You don't change reality to find yourself, you find yourself, and then reality changes. There are moments when everything seems to remain the same on the outside, but on the inside, something begins to break. Not a noisy, explosive break, but a silent rupture, almost imperceptible. It's as if the shell of the old perception begins to crack, and through the fissures, light starts to enter. A light that doesn't come from the outside. It comes from the center, from the still point that observes all versions contradicting each other, and still remains. At this stage, the old world still tries to call you. The old stories want to seduce you again. The mind becomes agitated, seeking old answers to new sensations. You start to realize that you're no longer inside the automatic script, but you don't yet know exactly who you are without it. It's like walking between two times. No longer the past, not yet the future. Just this dense, strange, and revealing present. The discomfort here is real and necessary, because it's in this transition zone that the identity built by survival begins to lose control. That part that always wanted to ensure everything made sense, that everything was under control, that you were seen, accepted, understood. This part begins to realize that it's no longer in charge, and that terrifies it. But at the same time, a freedom starts to emerge behind the fear, as if the absence of certainties opens a new kind of space, a space that was once occupied by judgments, expectations, attempts to please, to understand, to fit in. Now in this emerging emptiness, there is something more alive than any idea you've ever believed in. It's here that conscious observation becomes a portal, because in this space between what is dying and what has not yet been born, everything you observe begins to reveal its true nature. You look at fear and it no longer has claws. You look at doubt and realize it only wants time. You look at pain and see that it doesn't want to punish you. It's only waiting to be truly felt, without being pushed away, rationalized, or fought against. It is in this instant that the observer becomes an alchemist, because they begin to realize that everything arising in the field can be transmuted, not through force, but through presence, through the permission to feel, to look, to embrace without identifying. Anger, when silently observed, becomes clarity. Sadness, when not resisted, transforms into compassion. Fear, when seen with love, dissolves into subtle courage. What once seemed like uncontrollable emotion now reveals itself as malleable frequency. The internal field, once dense, begins to tune, and reality, which once seemed to push you into predictable reactions, begins to yield. Because it's no longer feeding on the old vibration, it's starting to respond to the new. Nothing has changed on the outside, but you are no longer the same who observes. And because of that, everything changes. It is a delicate transition, and sometimes a lonely one, because those around you may not perceive this inner revolution. They might even find your silence strange, your change of pace, your new way of looking at things. But you know, you feel, something has shifted, and there's no turning back. It's as if the world starts moving more slowly, not because everything has stopped, but because your perception no longer chases what no longer makes sense, no longer fights what once seemed like a threat, no longer needs to prove that it deserves to be here. The observer now rests in its own center, and from that center watches the dance of life with the eyes of one who knows. Everything is reflection, everything is frequency, everything is passage, and what was once experienced as burden begins to be seen as symbol. A delay might just be an invitation to silence, a loss, a reconfiguration of the essential, a conflict, a chance to see where resistance still lives. Reality ceases to be scenery. It becomes language, a living language that responds to what you are. And what you are at this point is no longer the character. It is the field. It is consciousness. It is the silence that holds everything. You will still feel fear, doubt, insecurity, but now there is something more. A gaze that doesn't confuse itself with the content, a presence that doesn't get lost in the narratives. And that is everything, because it is from there that reality truly begins to bend to the vibration of your silence. When the observer begins to awaken, a silent truth is revealed. Everything you tried to change through effort may have just been waiting to be seen with different eyes. What looked like a block was protection. What seemed like repetition was life insisting on showing you where resistance still lives. What seemed like bad luck was vibrational coherence. This kind of perception isn't light at first. It dismantles the foundations of victimhood. It dissolves the comfort of guilt. It breaks down the shield of self-defense. Because now, everything that happens is no longer random. It's a response. And when life becomes a conscious mirror, the only thing left is to observe with presence, or repeat with suffering. You begin to realize, for example, that it wasn't the other who hurt you. It was the part of you that expected to be hurt. That still believed love came with pain, that attention came with effort, that being seen required submission. While that remained unconscious, the world merely acted out those beliefs as reality. But now, there is awareness. And where there is awareness, there is no longer a hiding place for old patterns. They still show up, yes, but you see them before they take over the body, before they choose for you. And in that moment, between the emergence of the impulse and the choice not to follow it, the true power of transmutation is born. The conscious observer does not react. It doesn't flee. It doesn't need to defeat the old self. It simply recognizes it and walks through it. It's like walking inside a maze you built yourself, but now holding a map. You already know the hallways repeat, that the locked doors are illusions, that the way out is not outside, it's at the center. Observation at this point transforms into silent prayer, not the kind that asks, but the kind that recognizes. In every situation lived, the observer silently asks, "What is this scene showing me about my vibration?" And there, even in the most challenging moments, the answer begins to emerge, sometimes as intuition, sometimes as a chill, sometimes as a deep fatigue, revealing what no longer fits. There is something sacred in this process, because it doesn't accelerate through will. It only deepens with surrender. Not the surrender of the defeated, but of the awakened, who understands that reality doesn't need to be pushed. It needs to be observed until it aligns. This alignment isn't a permanent state. It is a constant return. You align and soon get lost. You awaken and fall asleep again. But over time, this back and forth becomes rhythm, and rhythm becomes flow, and flow becomes trust. Not trust in outcomes, but in coherence. You begin to trust that everything that arrives has a vibrational reason, that every experience carries information, that every encounter is revelation, and that life, once feared as a threat, now reveals itself as an ally. In this state, the questions change. The "why is this happening to me" dissolves into "what is my consciousness showing me this for?" And this simple shift changes everything. Because where once there was judgment, now there is listening. Where once there was fear, now there is curiosity. Where once there was separation, now there is intimacy with the real. And even when pain appears, you don't reject it. Because you know that the mature observer doesn't seek only pleasure. It seeks truth. And truth sometimes hurts, but it heals. It deconstructs, but it frees. It silences, but it reveals. This is where the cycle completes. The world that was once seen as the enemy becomes a teacher. The emotions that were once avoided become guides. The silence that once disturbed becomes home. And the self that once clung to identity dissolves into the field of presence. This is the space of the new. Not a new that comes with euphoria, but with solidity. Not the new that wants to be shown, but the one that anchors in silence. A new where the observer no longer wants to control the reflection, but honor it. Because it knows that each reflection reveals what must be felt in order to be transformed. And thus life ceases to be a battlefield and becomes a temple, where every experience is an initiation, every emotion a mirror, every reaction avoided a doorway, and every conscious observation one more step on the path back to center. There comes a point in the journey where there is nothing more to explain. What needed to be understood has already been felt. What needed to break has already dissolved in its own time, and that which once felt so urgent, so necessary to change, no longer carries the same weight. Because you are no longer the same one who observes. Reality may still present its challenges, but something fundamental has changed. Now there is a center, a space within that does not collapse in the face of chaos, that is not contaminated by external noise, that doesn't need to prove anything or chase after meaning. This center is the awakened observer, not the one who claims to be enlightened, but the one who has learned to see without distortion, to feel without resistance, to live without getting lost. You may notice this in the details, in how you no longer take offense at what once hurt you, in how you notice triggers arising but choose to breathe instead of react, in how you understand that repetition is not failure, it's an invitation, and that what returns because it still needs to be seen with today's eyes, not the eyes of pain. At this point in the path, silence becomes companionship, no longer emptiness, but presence, a kind of presence that observes without interfering, that welcomes without needing to fix, that understands everything has its time, and that even chaos has an intelligence that guides. You begin to feel more available for life, not because you control it better, but because you surrender with more truth, because you've learned that life doesn't bend to your will, but resonates with your vibration, and your vibration is born from who you are while you observe. The world then begins to show other faces. Situations once seen as threats now appear as tests of maturity. Words once received as attacks now are simply expressions of the other. And even another's pain ceases to be a burden, because you've learned not to carry what doesn't belong to you. This freedom has no label. It is internal, silent, almost invisible, but it transforms everything, because the being who walks like this, in coherence with their own presence, alters the field. Their simple observation is already a prayer. Their silence is already healing. Their vibration is already teaching. And at that point you understand what it truly means to change reality. It's not about forcing something to happen, nor resisting what comes, but rather refining your gaze until what you see no longer wounds you, refining your feeling until what you feel no longer needs to be avoided, refining your being until the world no longer needs to provoke you in order for you to awaken. This is the state of the true observer, the one who doesn't need to be right, who doesn't need to know what will come, who doesn't need to understand every detail to trust the whole. They simply observe, and by observing, transform. Thoth said, "What is within is like what is without," but few grasp the depth of this, because they think it's about creating the external from the internal, when in fact it's about revealing what's outside, through the eyes of one who has already cleared the inside. You are not here to conquer reality. You are here to remember the one who observes, and in remembering, everything changes, not because something was achieved, but because the veil has fallen. And behind the veil, everything was always as it should be. The process doesn't end here. Every day the old may knock at the door. But now you know, the answer isn't to close your eyes. It's to keep them open, even in discomfort, because it is exactly there where discomfort appears that the observer can choose to see differently. And when the gaze changes, the world obeys. You don't need more proof, nor guarantees, only presence. A presence so whole that it no longer needs to protect itself, because it already knows that everything that comes to align. So if something within you has been touched by this video, it may have already begun. The turning, the expansion, the silent shift where the observer recognizes themselves as the point of origin, and the world as a reflection of consciousness in motion. If this has crossed your field, write in the comments, "I observe differently now." That is the portal. Reality is already listening.